Next up, we have Paul Rezkalla. He is a graduate fellow from the Society of Christian Philosophers and an associate of the Ian Ramsey Centre of Science and Religion. He is currently a Ph.D. candidate in philosophy at Florida State University, and simultaneously, that's right folks, what are you doing today? Pursuing his Master of Science in Cognitive and Evolutionary Anthropology at Oxford University as part of his doctoral research on the evolution of morality. He holds an M.A. in philosophy from the University of Birmingham, not Alabama, UK. I don't think Alabama has a philosophy thing. It would be fried chicken. I was born there. I can jug on Birmingham. It's okay. But that's amazing. Birmingham, UK, and an M.A. in theology from St. John's University. Paul is going to come and talk to us about what's wrong with the scientific study of morality.
Well, thank you, guys. Actually, Birmingham in the UK is pronounced Birmingham, and it's the first thing they correct you on when you go there. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about science and morality, and specifically the relationship between the two. So I've done some empirical work on the evolution of morality, but I'm a philosopher by training. So basically I want to ruffle some feathers in the next 15 minutes. So if I ruffle some feathers, I'll have done my job properly. Chesterton, in his typical characteristic cutting wit, said, "The obvious truth is that that the moment any matter has passed through the human mind, it is finally and forever spoilt for all purposes of science." So what Chesterton's trying to get at here is that there's something about the inner mental life of humans that is inaccessible, perhaps in principle, by the scientific method. And so what he has here is things like certain cultural practices and the reasons for certain cultural practices, but I think this applies equally to the study of morality as well. So human reason, the reasons for which we act, and morality in general is a lot more than what scientists like to think when they look at morality through their evolutionary anthropology and comparative primatology and these sorts of things. So that's what we'll be talking about. So Chesterton specifically is aiming his critique at people and views embodied in people like E.O. Wilson, who said, "Scientists and humanists should consider together the possibility that the time has come for ethics to be removed temporarily from the hands of the philosophers and biologicized." Now, philosophers don't like this quote, they don't like this project, but ever since Wilson gave this charge, both in his publishing of Sociobiology in 1975 and subsequent works that he's written, he essentially grandfathered or fathered the fields of evolutionary psychology, human behavioral ecology, and the application of evolutionary thinking to human behavior, specifically morality. Lots of people rose to that challenge and tried to offer an explanation of human morality by looking at evolution, by looking at comparative primatology. So Robert Axelrod, Chris Bohm, Frans de Waal, whom you guys might be familiar with. These are people who have tried to explain morality purely scientifically, saying this is just something that evolved to help us cooperate. The morality as cooperation model or paradigm is the dominant model that's talked about today, so we'll look at that specifically. Then I'll look at one philosophical objection to that view, and then try to pose a stronger philosophical objection to the morality as cooperation model as well. So Michael Tomasello, who you may be familiar with, he's one of the biggest figures in evolution today. He's an evolutionary anthropologist and primatologist, done a lot of work on morality in infants and primates, non-human primates. He says morality is the ability to regulate an individual's social interactions with others in the general direction of cooperation, given that all individuals are at least somewhat selfish. So here we see Tomasello is boiling morality down to cooperation, saying that cooperation is something that evolved to help us deal with problems of conflict, resource distribution, things like that. So it's a reductionistic view of morality, but it does give you morality from an evolutionary perspective. So you might think, okay, we've got an answer here. We don't need to look at ethics. We don't need to do philosophy. Here we've just biologicized ethics, and so we've got our answer. Another famous person who works in this area, Oliver Curry, he's sort of the morality is cooperation guy. In a paper that he wrote, he said, morality turns out to just be a collection of biological and cultural solutions to the problems of cooperation and conflict recurrent in human social life. The study of morality has at last become a branch of science, and then even more boldly, morality is cooperation explains what morality is, where it comes from, how it works, and what it is for. So by my tone of voice there, you can tell that I'm not a fan of these kinds of conclusions as a philosopher. But not only that, they've taken this model and they've tried to test it. They've poured through the ethnographic literature, and they've tested in 61 different societies, I think it was, every instance where cooperation or helping was observed in the ethnographic record. 961 out of 962 observations were positively valenced. Every time you have a coding or a scoring of cooperation in the ethnographic record, 99.9% of those are positively valenced. So there you go, they're like, well, we've got our evidence that morality is just cooperation, because look at all these times that people cooperate, they talk about through cooperation, they're using that in a positive way, so they take this as evidence for why morality is just cooperation. But there's a problem here, and philosophers have for a long time tried to show that there's a problem with reducing or explaining morality as just a biological or sociobiological phenomenon. And this is typically how the philosophical response goes. So it's like, well, we've got science telling us that cooperation, altruism, and parental investment are good things. Cooperation is individuals or groups helping each other. Altruism is me helping you at a cost to myself. Parental investment is parents investing in their offspring, often at substantial cost themselves. So we see these things, and those are also things that we associate with morality. It's good to help others, it's good to sacrifice, it's good to invest in our kids. So science is like, we've got this explanation. We can explain where morality comes from, what morality is. And the philosophers say, yeah, you've got that, but you're missing this oughtness, this shouldness. Like, why should we cooperate? Why should we be altruistic? Why should we invest in our children? So this is how the dialectic goes. Philosophers say the scientists don't have this oughtness quality. They can only describe the phenomena of cooperation, altruism, and parental investment, but they can't prescribe. And so philosophy's role is adding normativity. It's just a fancy word for oughtness. Right? So science does the descriptive project. It tells us that these things evolved, and philosophy helps us by telling us not just that these things are there, but that we should do these things. And that's the typical dialectic. I think that there's a more fundamental problem, that there's a deeper problem with the scientific study of morality than just this picture. And I'll illustrate that with a couple of thought experiments. So imagine the case of John. John and Mary are two college professors at two different universities. John serves on the admissions committee at one university, and he gets an application from a minority student, okay? And this student has done all the requisite stuff, taking the SAT, good letter of recommendation, good personal statement, and he says, this is a good addition to our university, we should accept this minority student, it's great, it's fantastic. So he proceeds to accept this person and, put in his vote for accepting the minority student into the university. Now, in Mary's case, Mary's also a philosopher, Mary's also a professor at a university, and she's also on the admissions committee. She gets an application from a minority student, and she doesn't want her reputation to be tarnished. She doesn't want to come out as a racist. She's got racist tendencies. She doesn't want her colleagues to know this about her. So she also votes for accepting a minority student, but only because of this fear of reputation. She doesn't want people to label her or stigmatize her as a racist, and so she also puts forward the vote to accept the minority student. So on the outset, we've got the same observation in both cases. There's an embracing of racial diversity, what Kant would call acting in accordance with duty. But in both of these cases, there are actually two separate actions. In the first case, you've got somebody who's actually genuinely celebrating this minority student. In the second case, you don't have somebody's doing it. You have someone who's just trying to strive to protect their reputation. They're a racist, but they don't want that to get out there. So they're not actually being a good person. They're just acting out of self-interest. So the word maxim here is just a Kantian term from Immanuel Kant. which means that your maxim is not just your action, but it's your action plus the motivation or the intention that's driving the action. And so that's what ethics is about. It's about this combined action-intention phenomenon. It's not just the action or the outcome that we produce into the world. And so that, you can see, that's pushing tension against the scientific picture, which just wants to say that morality is cooperation, or it's this thing we put into the world, whereas morality is actually much deeper than that. Another quick case. So let's take John and Mary again. John's mother is in the hospital, and she's on a ventilator, and they're deciding not whether they should pull the plug. John thinks it would be a good decision, it would be a good stewarding of resources, because there's really low chances that his mother will make a full recovery. So he decides to pull the plug, and so there he's trying to just save resources. In Mary's case, her mom is in the hospital, also on the ventilator, on life support, but her mom is also just really, really wealthy. And Mary knows that she stands to gain and inherit a lot of wealth if her mom dies. And so Mary wants to make the decision to pull the plug, but because her intention is her mother's death, so that she can stand to receive all of this other wealth and financial resources. On the outset, we've got the same observation, we've got the same outcome in the world, pulling the plug. But we've also got two different maxims. John and Mary are doing two different things. John is saving resources, whereas Mary is intending the death of her mother. In the words of the 20th century British philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe, this would actually be murder, because the intention here, what's factoring into what Mary wants to do, what's factoring into Mary's decision, is the actual death of her mother. So that intention plus the action makes these two separate actions. And the scientific account can't make sense of this distinction. But morality is, this distinction is necessary for morality. So this is the deep problem with the morality as cooperation paradigm. This is the deep problem with scientific approaches to morality in general, which is that they fail to disambiguate or isolate or identify intentions and maxims. And these are the things that ethics is substantively about. It's not just about producing outcomes in the world. It's not just about behaviors or what we can observe, but when we try to evaluate people, what we're doing is we're looking at the character and the will that's also producing the effect in the world, and that sum total is the object of our ethical evaluation. It's not just what we produce in the world. So the observation in this case, embracing racial diversity, and the observation in the second case, pulling the plug, can look exactly the same, but these are two fundamentally different actions. In the case of the college professor who's accepting a minority student because he genuinely celebrates diversity and thinks this is a good student, versus the person who's just doing it to maintain their reputation. These are two fundamentally different actions with two different moral evaluations. One of them is praiseworthy, one of them is blameworthy. And the scientific approach can't make sense of this distinction. So I think that that's really problematic. So in sum, morality is not cooperation, because cooperation is just a description of a state of affairs in the world. And that goes the same for altruism, that goes the same for parental investment, that goes the same for all of these different objects of study that are amenable to scientific inquiry. But this is not what ethics is about, because ethics is about something much deeper, and it takes into account the will and the character and the intention of the individual. So ethics is more properly about maxims than it is just about outcomes and producing effects in the world. And because the scientific approach fails to make sense of that distinction, and fails to be able to identify and disambiguate morally impermissible acts from ones that are permissible by looking at their intentions, it's for that reason that the scientific approach ultimately fails. So it's more than just a problem of description versus prescription. It's that scientists and philosophers who are both looking at the phenomenon of morality are actually looking at two completely different phenomena. One is amenable to scientific inquiry, one is not. So I suspect that there may be questions about this. That's great. I'm happy to talk about this later. Feel free to grab me. But thank you for your time. Appreciate it.